Hello. Today we will be going through pedal making 101. The purpose of this video is to show you what your first pedal build will look like, specifically what tools and workstations you need, and then tips and techniques when it comes to soldering the pedal. We're talking, of course, about a guitar pedal. On the outside, we're familiar with this. We have a stomp switch to turn it on. We have a knob to adjust a parameter. There is an input-output jack with a power supply. And then here's where the magic happens, where you come in, is the inside of the pedal. So we have the circuit board, which is where we will be soldering our resistors and capacitors to. This is a very simple one knob fuzz kit, which we're going to talk about in the presentation. So we have the board with the parts, the resistors and capacitors. We have the stomp switch, which is called a 3PDT, 3-pole double throw switch, that comes with a board that you can solder onto. This board is important because it connects to the LED, which indicates that the pedal is on. This pedal does not have an LED. Opted not to include it, so you just got to believe that it's on there. And then the wiring job. So the wiring is the most, for me, the hardest part of wiring a pedal. The wire is what connects the board to the switch and the output jacks and the power supply. So when you do your first builds, I believe that that'll be the hardest part, is making sure these wires are going to the correct places. So now that we understand what we're going to be attempting, let me share my screen and we will talk through the presentation. Pedal making 101. So we'll be going through the tools and workstation, where to start, and then my technique and tips that I've gathered from my a decade and a half of soldering and watching YouTube videos. All right, so in terms of tools, you need a soldering gun with a temperature setting. This is very important. A solder that just has an adjustable heat setting from 1 to 5 will not serve you well, and you will get very frustrated. So make sure your soldering gun has a temperature setting. In terms of solder to use, there is leaded and unleaded solder. There's a lot of debate on it. I use leaded solder with a solder fan, which I forgot to include in here. I'll add that to the presentation. You want to be blowing your solder smoke out the window. It's very toxic. Do not breathe it. Put your fan right next to where you're soldering so that that smoke goes right out the window, because it has lead in it, which will kill you. So you can use 63-37 ratio, 60-40 ratio. The important thing is that you have very thin solder. I use 0.5 millimeter, but I've also used 0.3 millimeter in the past. Any thicker than this, and you're going to have problems melting it and have to use higher heat, which you don't want. So thinner solder, 0.5 millimeter or thinner, is easier because it has a lower melting point. With a pedal, we're working with very, very small parts with very, very small holes, so you can get away with 0.3 mil solder. You do want a solder gun stand to hold your soldering iron when you're not using it, and then you want a wire solder cleaner. This is like a little bin that has a wire ball in it, and you clean your solder by putting it in and out of the solder wire, and that keeps your tip clean for a long period of time. When you're soldering, things are getting very hot, so you want to be soldering on a silicone soldering mat. I did not have one of these when I started, and I melted my table. If you were on a wood table, you'd be burning it. So definitely get a silicone mat to put underneath your soldering. It also helps collect all the bits, the solder bits and wire bits, so that you can just fold up the mat and dump it in the garbage can afterwards. And then most importantly, you want to be soldering on a table or desk. For the first 10 years of my solder career, I was soldering on the floor, on ottomans, on couches, and it was bad news. So get yourself a table or a desk with a chair and be sitting in a comfortable position when you're soldering, with a light source next to a window with the window open. You want a nice professional workstation so that you can have the best solder possible without killing yourself or struggling against your environment. All right, so tools continue. This is beyond the soldering iron. You will need a Phillips screwdriver that allows you to screw the back onto the pedal. I use a solder sucker. In the beginning, your solder is going to be probably pretty messy, pretty sloppy. So if you need to redo a solder joint, you're going to want to be able to suck the solder out. They do make other things like a soldering wick. I haven't had luck with that, so I use a solder sucker. and that works for me. You'll want needle nose pliers. That's what allows you to hold the wire in place or the part in place. Trust me on this, you do not want to be using your fingers. Things get very hot and you will burn yourself. Get needle nose pliers. Wire strippers. When you're doing the wiring job, you're going to need to strip that wire. You can use an automatic one that is like these jaws that pull the piece off, or you can use a manual one where you just close the jaws and pull the wire through. Both work fine as long as they support your wire size, which is probably going to be 24 AWG. That's what I use. You can get it on Amazon in multiple colors. You will also separately need wire snippers. When you poke things through your circuit board, there's going to be leftover material on the end, and you will not be able to use your wire stripper cutter to get that, because you need to get right next to the board and it's a small area. So you need to get a small pair of like super fine wire snippers. To put the pot onto, affix the pot to the pedal, you're going to be screwing in a nut, and you don't want to be using a metal tool for that because you could potentially scratch it. So I recommend getting plastic rocket sockets. You can use wrenches or even needle nose pliers in a pinch. Maybe for your first pedal, that'll be fine since you're just trying to do a proof of concept. But as you advance and you start working with painted pedals or something you're going to want to show your friends that doesn't have scratches on it, you're going to want to switch to rocket sockets. And then finally, you'll need a multimeter. This is not absolutely required because resistors have color codes that allow you to interpret what the value is. But for me, I love knowing that I'm using the right resistor. So getting a multimeter allows me to test every resistor before I put it in. It also lets you test the circuit so that you can figure out where your electricity is flowing and where it's not. So I recommend getting a multimeter, but you can get away without it. Where should you start? What should your first pedal project be? I recommend a vintage fuzz or distortion kit. This has the least number of parts and no integrated circuit chips, which could get overheated and are difficult to solder. The hardest part for me of doing a pedal job, like we talked about, is wiring the wires and soldering those in and making sure they're in the correct order. And then you'll want to get a pre-drilled enclosure. At pedalpartsandkits.com, you can get a one knob fuzz, which is what this pedal is. It was my first pedal I built. This is the second time I've done it. It's a great pedal. It sounds cool. And most importantly, it's really easy in terms of having only a few resistors and capacitors and only one knob. You're practicing soldering. You're trying to understand the signal flow and working within a pedal enclosure. You're not trying to figure out how to source parts and where to buy them from and how to drill an enclosure. If you want to do that down the road, it's great fun and I recommend it. But for your first build, just get a kit, have them send you a pre-drilled enclosure with all the parts you need, and then all you have to worry about is putting it together. In terms of technique, I can do a separate video on this where I actually demo some of these techniques, but I recommend having 2 soldering iron heads. Getting a pencil tip allows you to put the soldering tip at an angle to resistor legs or wires while you're touching the soldering pad. And it's very fine, again, since you're working with small parts. When you switch to soldering bigger pieces like the volume pot or the 3P-DT switch, I switch to a flathead tip, which gives me greater contact on these bigger parts and heats it up faster. So there's your 2 tips. You can test your ideal iron temperature by putting solder onto the tip of your soldering iron. The solder should melt gently onto the tip. It should not bubble and spit or burn. That means your soldering iron is too hot. So a temperature around 650 to 700 is probably where you're going to want to be depending on your solder thickness. Clean the tip regularly. So when you go to start soldering, you're going to put soldering iron on your tip and then put it in and out of your solder cleaner. Now you're ready to go. You've got a nice thin layer of solder on your tip, and then you'll solder maybe 5 to 10 pieces, and then, or 5 to 10 solder actions. So resistor has 2 legs. You solder 5 resistors. That's 10 solders. Clean your solder tip, retin, clean, go again. That'll give you a really even heat application and keep your tip fresh for a long time. When you are soldering, you're heating up the part, like so your resistor leg goes through the heating pad of a PCB. So you're heating the leg and the ring at the same time. When those 2 parts get to temperature, then you touch the solder to it and the solder will melt. You do not touch your solder to your soldering iron and have it melt onto the part. That will create a pretty janky solder connection and could result in burned solder as well, which you don't want. So when you are actually doing the soldering, do not put the solder onto the tip, touch it to the part you're trying to solder, and if the part is at temperature, the solder will melt. You're going to want to wait until the temperature has been reached for the part. Don't just sit there with the solder on the part and the solder gun heating it at the same time, because then your solder will like slowly melt and could be inconsistent. Wait for it to get to temperature, and when you touch it, it should melt immediately. Usually that's about 5 to 8 seconds if you're establishing a good connection. You don't want to overheat anything, especially your Stompy switch. So don't hold the soldering iron on something longer than 8 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is where you could probably apply it. But if it's not, or if it's a bigger piece like the stomp switch, it might take 8 seconds. And then let the piece cool before you keep going. Don't do more than 2 or 3 lugs of the stomp switch at a time. Make sure you build some brakes in there. If you overheat the stomp switch, it will burn out and it will not work. And I've done that before, and it's a bummer because then you have to get a new stomp switch in there. So only do 1 or 2 or 3 lugs at the most at a time and let it cool. We're trying to use as minimal solder as possible for a clean joint. So don't create this like giant bubble of solder. That looks bad and it's inconsistent. So just apply a little bit of solder and then a little bit more. And as it fills, you'll kind of see it form this beautiful lake that's shiny. And then as it hardens, it will become dull. And that's what you want. The last technique tip is that the grounds and hots are a chain. So you're running your 9-volt power from the 9-volt piece and a ground off of this, because every hot needs to have a ground. You have a hot and ground coming off of the input output. So make sure you're kind of tracking how that flow is going, and it doesn't really matter what 9-volt and what ground you use on the Stompy switch and on the board. It's all a part of a signal path that doesn't have an order. 9-volt and ground does not have an order. I didn't understand this when I started doing pedal work. I understand it now, and it's much less stressful knowing as long as all of my 9-volts and grounds are connected, the board, the stomp switch, and the power supply, the pedal will work. All right, some tips when it comes to doing your soldering. Organize your parts in order before you start soldering. So the resistors are numbered 1 through 10, line those up 1 through 10, line your capacitors up. You only have to do one at a time. So you can do all your resistors first and then line up your capacitors. Test your resistors with a multimeter like we talked about. Your capacitors have codes, so you'll be able to Google what the code is and it'll tell you to make sure you're using the correct value. Take a break in between things. Don't be in a rush to finish. So with me, I do the resistors first, and then I take a break. I double check my work, get some water, come back, then do the capacitors. Don't be in a rush. This is especially true for the wiring. Go part by part, do a jack on its own, check your wiring diagram, check how you did it, then move on, do the other jack, do a 9-volt. Always be referring back to your wiring diagram and understanding, okay, this is the input jack, this is the output jack. The input jack is going to the inside of the stomp switch. The output jack is going to the outside of the stomp switch. Hot is hot, ground is ground. Verify those connections. If you have a problem when your pedal's all together and it's not working, it's usually going to be because your wiring is off and you botched a hot or a ground somewhere. The third tip is solder in height order. So when you're soldering your board, and again, I'm hoping to have a video for this, but you're going to put your resistor in the board and then flip the board upside down and solder the resistor in place. So starting with your resistors, because they sit flush to the board, and then your short capacitors and then your tall capacitors, ensures that as you're flipping the board, you're still going to be able to do the parts without them falling out. That'll make more sense in a separate video, but go in height order: resistors, short caps, tall caps, and then end with your wires. I recommend wiring your board and then the accessories. So this does mean placing the board in the pedal where it's going to go, and then wiring it understanding the distance of wire, cutting the wire to the correct distance, and then soldering the wire one side to the board and doing all your wires, and then, wiring it up. I think that's easier, but you can also go the other way where you put wires, long wires on all your parts and then wire them to the board. For me, that gets a little tricky with moving the board around to get the soldering right. Again, we'll talk about this in a separate video. Another top tip, better to have wire too long than too short. So as you're cutting your wire so that it's not all over the place, this is not my best wiring job, but you can see that there's not huge amounts of wire in here. There's slack, the wire is not taut, but it's also not like all bunched up down here because there's a bunch of excess. So cut your wire a little bit too long so that you have some wiggle room, and that's better than cutting it too short and having to cut a new piece of wire. The final tip is don't burn the board, which we talked about. Don't hold the soldering iron on a single piece for too long and then be like, well, why is the solder not melting? It's because you're not creating a good connection with the parts you're trying to heat. So if after 8 seconds, you're not able to melt the solder, step back, let the thing cool off, check your solder temperature, tin the soldering tip to make sure it's still hot, clean your solder tip, and then try again, this time making sure that you're making contact with both the parts you're trying to solder together. Wait the 5 to 8 seconds, touch it with the solder, see if it melts. And then the last rule, which I wish I would have known 15 years ago, is don't chase the solder. What I mean by that is this is a challenging thing because you have the soldering gun, you have the parts you're trying to solder, and then you're actually holding the solder. That's 3 things, and we only have 2 arms. So you have to develop a technique either using a third hand system, which is a tool that lets you hold pieces together. I'll show that in a separate video. Or if you're doing it on the desk, you have to orient the piece in a way that it's holding steady as you're going in with the solder and the soldering iron. If the piece is moving and the parts are moving as you're trying to solder it, just stop, because you're going to burn yourself, you're going to burn the board. It's going to get really frustrating really fast. So don't chase the solder, don't burn the board. And that's my presentation. So that was a little longer than I expected, but I think this is useful information. So I encourage you to do your first pedal project, do a simple fuzz or distortion kit and have fun doing it. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or anyone else you know that solders. It's a great community and it's great fun. Thank you.